Hey serverless friends, welcome to my session, Creating the Azure Functions Updates Twitter bot. My name is Mark Duiker. I'm a lead Azure consultant for Xspirit. I'm an Azure MVP and I'm also the creator of Azure Functions University, a free learning resource on GitHub and YouTube to learn all about Azure Functions. But today we're talking about the Twitter bot I made a while ago. This is an example you see here. It tweets whenever there's a new release available on GitHub. It will then post a tweet containing the name of the repository, the version information, when it was released, and then a link to GitHub so you can get more information there. So in this session, I'm going to talk about the idea, and so why I built this. I will show you the code, how it's built, and also the idea, the design behind it. So first, let's start with the idea. So the idea started quite a while ago when I was just working with Azure Functions, and I wanted to be notified of new releases, and that was because a lot of things were happening with Azure Functions. There were a lot of different packages to use, and things were changing all the time. It is still changing frequently, but especially in the beginning, it was quite difficult to stay up to date with all of these changes. And that's because the Azure Functions ecosystem is really big. I have a list here of all the things that the Twitter bot is currently monitoring, and I think the list is even bigger right now, but there are really dozens and dozens of repositories on GitHub that deal with Azure Functions. There are the individual language workers. There are all kinds of extensions related to different bindings. There are things like the core tools is also a separate repository, the Azure Functions host, but also templates for Visual Studio, but also actions for GitHub to build and publish your Azure Functions. So there's a lot of things going on, and of course you don't need to know about all of these packages, but it is useful if you can have a very light manner to stay up to date of these changes. So let's have a look at the design that I came up with. So I had to make a couple of choices. So my first choice was, what is the source of the information? And I quickly came to GitHub. I briefly thought about using NuGet as a source, but then I'm only limited to .NET. The same for NPM, that would only be limited to JavaScript and TypeScript. But if I use GitHub as a source, then I'm covered for all the languages and also all of the other things that the product team is building, because they do it all out in the open on GitHub. So GitHub is a great source to use. Then for the notifications, there I also quickly settled on Twitter, because a lot of people, technical people I know, are already on Twitter, so it's then relatively easy to follow an account and stay up to date of these notifications. I have a bit of data to store, and I'll go into a bit more detail later, but that's more configuration data, so which repositories I'm monitoring and what will be information that I'll put in a tweet. But the other part is storing the latest release information from GitHub, so I can compare between different runs, which is the latest information that I have and what's the latest information from GitHub. So I briefly thought about Cosmos DB there, but at the time when I made this, there was no serverless offering for Cosmos DB just yet. So that's why I settled for table storage then. It still works fine. But if I would start all over again now, I would probably go for the serverless option of Cosmos DB. And the final part is where does it run my logic? And for this one, since it's about Azure Functions, and I'm also the most comfortable with Azure Functions, I'm building it in Azure Functions. To be honest, I think you could also build it with logic apps. So the application has a couple of domain models, which I would like to highlight before we dive into the code. The first one is called the repository configuration. So that is stored in table storage, and that contains the minimum information I need to retrieve the release information about a certain repository from GitHub. And it also contains a bit of information that I want to post in a tweet, because it contains some specific hashtags. So it's not a lot of information, just a couple of fields, just enough to get the data and post it to Twitter. Another model is the repository release. So that's the information I get from GitHub, but I'm storing it myself because I want to be able to compare it with another release I get from GitHub. So I know, is it a new release or is it the same release? Do I need to tweet about it? So that's why I'm storing it. I'm not saving the complete release information from GitHub because it contains really quite a lot. Just a couple of values, so I know what's the latest version and the latest date, things like that. Then there is a latest releases object, and that object contains two release objects, two repository release objects. It contains the release information from GitHub, and it contains the release information which I've stored in table storage. And in addition, the latest release model contains a few handy methods to compare between the two. So I can use it to determine, okay, is this release from GitHub, is it new? And if so, do I need to store it? And do I need to post it to Twitter? The final object I'm using is called the update message, and that contains all the required information I need to give this message to Twitter. So it contains a description and some links and hashtags and so on. So this contains the entire workflow that's going on, because there are several steps involved. First, we will retrieve some of the configurations from storage. And so which repositories are we monitoring? I'm keeping it here. Then for each of those repositories, we are getting the latest release information from GitHub. So I'm talking to the GitHub API. And for the same repository, I'm looking in my own history table, in my own history release table, also table storage. The next step is then to compare the two, and that's done in that special latest releases object. And if it turns out that the GitHub GitHub repo release is newer, then I'll save the release so I can use it for next time. And if it also turns out to be a relatively new release, then I'll also post it to Twitter. So I'm also talking to the Twitter API here. So this thing is a workflow, and workflows can be made, like I said before, in Logic apps. But if you're creating workflows in code, then durable functions is a great choice. So I won't go into a lot of detail about all of the possibilities you have with creating workflows in Azure Functions. There's a great package called Durable Functions, which you can install. It's available in multiple languages. If you want to know more about durable functions, then please watch the session by Jonah Anderson, because she will go into detail about durable functions and the different application patterns you can use. So definitely watch that session. So I already went over the individual boxes, but initially it's triggered by a timer in this case, and then it will start this workflow. And yeah, the workflow is just a grouping of all of these individual boxes, and then the boxes themselves are then activities in that workflow. The compare releases is a bit of an outlier because that is just a method and not a separate activity function. All right, so let's have a look at some code. And before I dive into VS Code to show you the code, I would recommend you to go to this link yourself. So github.com/markduiker/acfuncupdates. So that's the repository where all of the source code is. Clone the repo, open it with VS Code, and then you'll get a recommendation to install this code tour extension. And CodeTour is a really lovely extension that will allow you to navigate through your source code. In this case, my source code, in a very easy way, and it allows you to learn a bit more about the source code. So you can use this, of course, now to view the source code, and I've annotated quite some bits, so you learn a bit more about it. But you can also use it yourself to create your own code tours. So if you're interested in open source development and you want to add some kind of documentation, you don't have to do it in Code Commons. You can do this now in this code tours, and you can even run the code tours straight from GitHub these days. So you don't even need to clone the repo and download it. You can even start it from GitHub itself. Let's now switch to the code. Here we go. All right, so I'm here in VS Code. I have a menu on the right. I just prefer it like that. I've got this CodeTour extension installed, and when you're in this Explorer mode, you'll have one of these tabs called CodeTour, and it will list the AC-Func updates CodeTour, and that contains 26 steps. I'm not gonna go through all of them because we simply don't have the time. I'll just focus on the timer function and then the orchestrator. And it keeps showing previews of the steps. But I won't go into all of the activities, but you can do that yourself, either on GitHub or when you clone this repo locally. So let me start with the overview. So when I click on these steps, it just takes me to the source code where the steps belong to. Some steps are not related to source code. So in this case, I have an overview step that doesn't belong to any file or folder. So that's just to introduce you to how to use this CodeTour and explains a bit about the technical components. So in this case, the function app is built in .NET Core 3.1. It's using durable functions. I'm using table storage. I'm using OctoKit for communicating with GitHub. So OctoKit is really a great package, also available in different languages. So I'm of course using the .NET version of it. And to communicate with Twitter, I'm using the TweetInv API, which is also very easy to use. So again, we see the diagram we saw before. And then we can click on this link here below. So this is how we navigate using CodeTour. Using these links. So we first arrive at the client function. So that's where it all starts. In this case, it's a timer-based function, and we can see that it triggers every 2 hours. So now in this part. And the responsibility of this timer trigger function is to create an instance of my orchestration function. So that's what's happening here. Client, start new async, and then we provide the name of the orchestrator function that we want to run. So let's have a look at that orchestrator. So we're now in the orchestrator function. The release update orchestration it's called. And Azure Functions know that this is an orchestrator function because we're using the orchestration trigger attribute here. Again, follow Jonah Anderson's talk to learn more about orchestrations and how to program them. So one of the first things that's happening in this orchestration trigger, well, the very first thing is that I want to read my repository configurations from table storage because I need to know which GitHub repositories I want to query if there are new releases. So that's what's happening here. So I'm using the durable orchestration context, and then there's a call activity with retry async method. And then I'm specifying the type that I expect back. So I am expecting a read-only list of repository configurations back. And then I need to provide the function name of the activity I want to call. So it's the get repository configuration activity here, this one. But since I'm using the call activity with retry async methods, I can also specify some retry options. So here you see it's very easy to call an activity, but in case the activity fails, durable functions can retry that activity for you. And by supplying these retry options, you can specify how many times you want to retry, what should be the delay between retrying, those kind of things. So I put that information in one of the builders. So I'm calling this function, but in case it fails, it will retry based on these settings. In this case, I don't have any input for this activity function, so my input is null. So I won't go in this activity right now. You can do it yourself. But what I get back is a list of repository configurations. And now I am going to the activity. I'm going to skip that. So once we get back, I'm checking, okay, do I have any repository configurations? Because if I don't have, then I can just immediately quit. But if there are repository configurations available, then I want to know the releases, and I want to check the releases both from GitHub and from my history table in table storage. So I have a separate method for that. So what I'm doing here is I'm first preparing two lists, and those are lists of tasks. And the first task is the GitHub repository release, and the second one is the history repository release. So I'm preparing these two tasks, and then I am looping over my repository configurations. So that's about the 50 repositories I'm going to check. And then I am again using the call activity with retry async method, but I am not awaiting them. So that's quite an important detail. So I want to get the latest release from GitHub. So I'm calling that activity, but I'm not awaiting it. So I'm only preparing the task, but I'm not executing the task. And the same is true for the activity that gets the release information from my history table. I'm only preparing, creating the task, but not executing it. So when this loop is finished, I've got two lists of each containing, let's say, 50 tasks. One to call out to GitHub to get the release information, one to call out to my history table with all of these releases. So that's what's being returned. Oh, now we go into the activities again. I don't want that. Let's get back to the orchestrator. All right, and here I'm saying in the orchestrator, now I want you to wait until you complete all of these GitHub releases tasks. So now durable functions will fan out. It will call the GitHub activity, which will try to call it not in sequence, but it will try to call out as much in parallel as possible. But I won't allow this orchestration to continue until all the information is there, because I do need all of that information before I can continue. So that's doing it for the GitHub releases and also for the history releases. So once these two steps are complete, then I have all of the information that I need to compare the GitHub release against the history release. So once I have that, I am again iterating over all of my repository configurations, and I'm using a builder to create me that latest releases object. And that object will actually do the comparison between the GitHub release and the history release. Once I have that, then I can save it. Let me go here now, a step further. I have another private method, which is about saving the latest release. So I'm checking a property of my latest release object that contains some logic if this release is new and should it be stored. So if that's true, then I'm calling another activity function, the save latest release activity function, with this release from GitHub. So then I have that in my home storage. I can use that to compare for the next time this function is run. So I won't go in the activity, and then the final step in the orchestrator is to post the latest release to Twitter. Now, I'm only doing that post to Twitter if all of these conditions are met. So first, I have a feature toggle called do post update, because sometimes I'm playing around with my code and I only have a production instance running and I don't want to mess up my production instance. So sometimes I've got this feature toggle turned off. So the code executes, it combines information, gathers information from all of these sources, but it won't do any update. So just as a fail-safe. The second thing I'm checking is the latest release actually saved in the last step, because I'm setting that in the code once the step is complete. The final check is again a check that's done in my latest release object. Is this a new release and should those be posted? So previously there was a check called is new and should be stored. That only means I didn't have this release in my own history table previously. But this is a slightly different check because this also takes into account a certain time window, which I think it's still relevant to send the notification. Because you could have the case that I am adding a new repository in my configuration and that might have very old release information. So I do want to store that in my table storage to compare new releases against, but I don't necessarily want to post these old releases to Twitter because they have very little value probably. So that's why I have a separate property to check that. Then I'm using a message builder to create me one of these update messages, which contains the required information for the tweet. And I'm calling the post update activity, which actually talks to the Twitter API. Right. Let's now switch back to the slides. So there's a lot of more things happening in the code, but given the limited time, I think it's best if you look at it yourself. And if you have questions, you know where to find me. My Twitter handle is right here, so you know where to find me. So definitely try to use this this code tour extension, not only for reading, but also try to create some code tours yourself for your own projects. Just to highlight how quickly you can get something up and running and even in production, because my first version of actually tweeting things out in the open was just after 5 evenings of work. So I was really impressed with how quickly you can get up and running with a function app, which it still does quite some steps. So that really shows the power of Azure Functions, I think. So if you want to be notified of new Azure Functions related releases, then please go to Twitter and follow the az_func_updates Twitter account. And the link down here, that is my YouTube channel, serverless on Azure, contains a lot of things about Azure Functions and durable functions. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.